So next up we have Jacob Washburn, who's with the USDA ARS in Columbia, Missouri. I think I said it right that time.
Yeah, no, this will be fine. All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a wonderful meeting. I've really enjoyed it so far. So I wanted to introduce a little bit of myself and my lab. So I started about the same time as Diane in my USDA position right before the pandemic hit, but we're slowly growing. We've got a few folks working with us now. And I'm talking about deep learning methods today, but we work on a lot of other things in our lab as well. Have a lot of feelers out, and we're waiting to see what sticks, I guess. So I don't have to repeat too much about an interest in environment, genetics, management, how these might play together in biology to create phenotypes. And the data that I'm going to be talking about today all comes from the Genomes to Fields initiative, which was mentioned earlier in the meeting. Basically, this is going on, I think this is about 8 years now of data from multiple locations with several thousand different corn hybrids. So it's becoming quite a nice data set to work with. I'm going to talk about deep learning methods today. This is a sort of a subset of machine learning methods. Some of the reasons why these are potentially interesting, there's a lot of flexibility in terms of what you can put into them. They're really designed for very complex relationships. And they have the potential to be less human bias or sort of a non-reductionist in some way. I have question marks there because that's not entirely certain, but there's the potential for that. They're very data-driven. You don't have to make a lot of determinations about what the model is going to be from the beginning. To kind of give you an intuitive feel for deep learning, you can think about a polynomial with different degrees, right? And this isn't technically correct, but just as an intuitive feel, you know, as you add degrees, it becomes a better fit, but at some point it becomes overfit with too many degrees. And with deep learning, there's kind of something similar to this. Again, it's not technically correct, but we have different hyperparameters that you tune, and the purpose of tuning these parameters is really to determine this fit and try to not over or underfit your model. And so that's really the whole game. You do this using training and validation sets. You know, sometimes you can split your data into all sorts of different sets to try to make this process better. And then eventually you use a test set that's never been shown to the model previously for the results. So the type of model that we're primarily talking about today are convolutional neural network models or fully connected models where we're putting weather, soil, and genetic data into these models. That's really all that you need to know. If you're interested in more details, I'm happy to talk after. And then, again, probably don't need to talk about this too much, but there's different ways that you could build these tests, where you could sort of train on just the environment data and other genetics, and you could make the test set, new genotypes that have never been seen. You could sort of make the test set based on things that have previously been seen. That's not as interesting. You could hold out environments. Or really the case that we typically care the most about is trying to predict into new genetics and new environments. So that's what I'm going to focus on the most today, and not really talk particularly about these other categories. So some of our results from a publication from last year is, so when you're in this situation where you're predicting into an environment you've already seen before, we see that using a sort of environmentally informed G-BLUP model, which I'm calling a G by E BLUP model, we can get quite a gain on top of a very standard G-BLUP type model. And our CNN approach performs reasonably well, but a little bit worse than this environmentally informed G-BLUP type of model. What we see sort of over and over again in the models that we've been building in my lab is that we typically see that our models actually have an advantage over a linear model type framework when we go into more complex scenarios. So particularly with environment, when we're trying to predict into new environments, this is really the only place in our work where we see any advantage in terms of just, good old-fashioned accuracy, right? And sometimes it's more significant than others depending on the models that we've been working on. So I think that's kind of the first take-home message. These models can outperform a G-BLUP type method, and they regularly do in the work that we're doing, but they certainly don't always, and there's no guarantee that they will. Another interesting finding that goes along with some of the previous talks, actually a great introduction. So at the time when I was working on this paper originally, we were using genomes to fields data, and this is kind of the number of data points that we had for each of these different types of data from the Genomes to Fields initiative, with quite a bit of filtering as well. We went back and added a bunch of data from historical, county level data, soil and weather data, and this actually gave us a pretty good increase in the accuracy of our model, just by adding this very messy historical data. So we're predicting onto the exact same test set. All we're predicting on is based on a subset of G2F, but we've basically pre-trained our models with some of this historical data to kind of help the model get oriented better, I guess, before giving it our new data. And I'll come back to some of the potential bad consequences of this as well in a little bit. So about a year ago, I hired my first postdoc in our lab, Daniel Kick, who's an amazing hire. And he started working on several questions. And particularly, I want to tell you about the work that he's been doing on optimization and how one goes about optimizing one of these types of models. So the question that he asked, he thought of kind of two different scenarios, one that he called consecutive optimization. So in this case, you're basically taking, here genetics, and you're predicting the yield, and you're pretty much acting as if that's the only data type you have. So you go through all the process of building the model, doing all these, validations, hyperparameter optimization, and you get the very best model you can for predicting yield from DNA all by itself. And then you do the exact same thing for soil by itself, for weather and management, and so you have basically these three separate models that are the best that you could possibly get them. You still haven't shown them your test set data at all, and then you combine them and you do sort of a short optimization at the end to combine the results of all three of them together. So that's the consecutive approach. The other approach he called simultaneous, and this is basically where you take the full data set from the beginning, you stick it all together, you do all your optimization and everything based on the whole thing all at once. And so which one performed better, at least in our hands? We found pretty substantially that the consecutive approach worked better. And I was a little bit surprised about that, actually, because I thought it might reduce some potential for interactions or other things. But we see pretty clearly that this consecutive approach, at least in our hands with this data set, seems to be a much better way of kind kind of wading through the challenges of developing a deep learning model, which it is quite an art form, actually. And so I think this is a useful finding. Another thing that this allows us to do is think about the significance of some of these different data types. And what you see here with his independent models, genetics alone or soil alone, you can build a model with some accuracy. Putting the weather and management data in, by itself, the accuracy was higher, but there's also this huge amount of variation. And so, actually in both, really all the work that we've done so far, we're looking at this question, we haven't found any scenario where removing data that we have is helpful to giving us a better model. We've pretty much always adding more data has been helpful, and that partially might be due to the fact that deep learning models are designed for large amounts of data, right? And so just having a larger data set, even if the data is not super great, actually can help this type of model. Certainly adding data that's wrong is not going to help it, but another question that we've looked into is how does the data type sort of change the way the model interprets or what the model thinks is important. And this is one interesting thing I think about these deep learning frameworks is that they're not mechanistic, and they are there is somewhat of a black box, but there's also a lot of tools you can use to look into that box and to see what's going on. And so I guess the answer to this question is yes. The data that we put in changes a great deal what the model sort of determines to be most important to its predictive accuracy. But I want to show you a couple of examples. So this is where I'm coming back to the idea of using historical data, basically data that's a lot messier, but actually did increase our model. Here are several different factors. This is sort of the relative importance of these different categories. And this is without the historical data. When we add in that historical data, we actually see quite a shift. Again, our accuracy goes up, but we see a shift in what is considered important by the model. And if you were to look back a couple of slides, what you would notice is that for historical data, the two things that we don't have for historical data are the genetics and the fertility data. So I actually think that this is related to the fact that that historical data now has a stronger weight in the model. And so I think that's a cautionary piece, perhaps, is that, yes, you can increase your predictive accuracy by adding historical data, but you might also be really changing the way that your model, I think we go into deep learning not expecting the model to necessarily be biologically accurate to begin with. But certainly the interpretation of this is affected very much by the data that you put in. It's great that it's built based on the data and you don't have to come in and sort of say, here's what I think is important a priori and put your human bias in, but at the same time your data is biasing the model too, right? And what data is available, ascertainment bias. We have there's one other example in this. So this is a similar kind of importance score. The darker colors are what's more important. This is days before or after sowing. And this is just the weather and management submodel. These are a number of different weather factors. It doesn't really matter the specifics of these, but you'll see that there's some places on here at different times in the season that you might wonder, why would 200 days post-planting, a lot of this stuff's harvested by then. have an impact. So some of these things could be overfitting, maybe they're not. But we do see as we add more data, so this is when we've added in now genetics and soil, that some of these things change, right? And so that's kind of a hypothesis of one way that adding more data may actually be helping us to, removing some overfitting from our models. So a few quick conclusions. So as I said, the CNNs can, but are certainly not guaranteed to outpredict standard GBLUP type models. We see an edge whenever we're doing these sort of very complicated holdout of genetic and environment. That's where we see the greatest gain in accuracy. As I said, historical data can improve the accuracy of these models, and the consecutive approach in our hands has been the best way to develop them. The question I'm always asked, which is similar to what was asked about the crop growth model work earlier, is, are these ready for broad use in plant breeding? And I think the answer to that is these models require a lot of data. And so I don't think that they're really ready for a small breeding program at the moment. I am fairly confident that large breeding programs, across multiple countries are using these types of models. And I think that's where they shine at the moment. There's a lot of work that we're doing in how transferable they might be from one crop to another. And so I think, I wanted to show this little graphic of, this is in the late 1800s, and it took us 100 years to get to where we are today, right? And so, I think that deep learning is a very young technology, especially in its application to agriculture. And so, I think we're at a point where we would be foolish to either consider it a silver bullet or to consider it as something that's not useful. I think there's a lot of work left to do to determine those things. So a lot of future things, there we go, there's a lot of future things that my lab is working on. I do think that we need a lot more and better data. I eventually would like to get more into mechanistic models. I'm not quite as smart as Charlie and Christine and some of these other ones. My attempts at mechanistic models have all failed so far miserably. But with that, I want to just thank my supporters, and I know there's not enough time for questions. I wanted to give a quick plug. We have the Genomes to Fields Initiative is doing a prediction contest this fall. So, any model, submit it, you could win some money. So.